So many questions around the future of work. Today's guest, Chris Dimming, thinks anthropology might hold all the answers to our most difficult challenges we have today. And then we're going to discuss Google, the hybrid work from home model, and how does it apply and what do we think about that as for the future of work and how does it apply to the industry as a whole. Google's such a guiding light, and we want to discuss what does that mean for every organization, and also from an anthropologic. I don't know if that's the right word. Chris will certainly tell me anyway and give me directions. But before we move on, I just want to say hello and welcome to Chris Dimming from Chris Dimming. How you doing, sir? Great to have you.
I'm good. I'm great, Steve. Thanks for your thanks for introducing me. I mean, I think that anthropology holds some of the answers, but not all.
I'm just taking your title, mate. I'm just taking your title from the article that you've written. But anyway, it's going to be great. As I said to you before, I'm so excited to have you here. You know, we've been emailing, you've been sending me presentations, and we've had conversations about your background and what your approach is, and across multiple industries in multiple geographies around the world, and your approach and your process and thinking, that logical thinking analysis, I think is fascinating, and I think there's a lot for us to learn as we think about workplace. So I'm looking forward to digging right into this. But we're just chatting. You're in Virginia. I'm in New York, and I've got a nice blue sky. You haven't quite got a blue sky right there right now. But we were chatting before about are you a morning person or are you an evening person? You're kind of like somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I'm kind of a boring sort of mid-afternoon, mid-morning.
Hey, it's just and we're going to dig into some of this because I think it's a fascinating thing when you think about team dynamics. I'm a morning person. There are a lot of people on my team that are evening people, and you're middle of the day people. How do teams come together in those things, right? Because sometimes energy levels fluctuate. How do you align those different things? But those are going to be some of the topics we're going to talk about today, folks. So, so thank you for coming along. If this is your first time coming across the channel, thank you for joining us. I hope you find value in the conversation between Chris and I today. Feel free to drop comments or questions for us in the section below. We'll get to them, and it'll help direct the conversation. So we appreciate your participation. If you do like it, do give us a thumbs up. That helps YouTube tell people that people may like this and so help spread the word for us. Do subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you're alerted to all upcoming videos. We typically broadcast each weekday morning, Monday to Thursday at 8 a.m. Eastern. So do come and don't miss out. And there is a link to a newsletter where we will send to you links of the show, what we're talking about, and also some of the content in Open Source Workplace. Another thing we've just added is a Discord channel. This is where the community gets together to share information, communicate, talk, get ideas, and actually get access to great research that people are putting together. I'm blown away by some of the information that people are sharing and the links that people go to collect information. It's fantastic, and I've certainly found value in it, and I've certainly learned from the folks on our Discord channel. So thank you for those folks who have joined, and I do encourage you to go ahead and join. So without further ado, Chris, I got to pull this up, man, because this is what you told us. Anthropology might hold answers to the most difficult workplace challenges. Now, before we dig into that article, what is anthropology? Just so that the audience is totally aware of what anthropology is.
Right. So anthropology is the study of people and social context in a particular place. And so essentially it involves methodology of observing how people interact with each other and also asking the questions about why they think the things they do and why they do the things they do. And then in turn, I'm an applied anthropologist as I practice anthropology outside of academia.
Got it. So I mean, you just take what you just said, how you described it. It's just such a natural fit, workplace and anthropology, right? Just the observation and analysis and really digging into social key interactions, and then how do you create an environment around that. So how did you get into workplace? Because I often find it really interesting to understand how people fall into workplace. Very few people actually go out of their way to get into workplace. So I was just curious how you got into it.
Well, it was an interest that appeared. I didn't really know much about workplace strategy at the time I started to think about it. But my PhD research was in Pristina and Kosovo, and a lot of what I was doing was I was observing how people were interacting primarily in public spaces and how they were forming relationships with each other. My research in Pristina involved observing interactions in cafes and bars and in squares, and so gave me an appreciation for the importance of space. And then as I was focusing on sorts of the interactions, I found that actually a type of proxy for interpersonal relationship was the exchange of coffee. And so through exchanging coffee, people were able to maintain and start relationships with others. And that sort of dynamic that I was watching of this process of continually forming and maintaining relationships combined with the importance of the space led me to be primarily interested in space and how people interact after the PhD. And then as I was started to think about what I wanted to do, someone said, well, Chris, you want to be an applied anthropologist. You seem to have a really direct perception of impact. Why don't you think maybe about how people interact with the built environment in some way? And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then um, some conversations led to workplace strategy. And of course, I thought, well, what's this? But that sounds interesting. So I read a few white papers, and I talked to a few people in the field, and I realized that some of the conversations around collaboration were particularly applicable to me because I had been looking at how people interact and form relationships. And so in order to collaborate, you need to actually have a degree of trust, and you need to have a degree of social capital in order to collaborate with people around you. And so there is a direct parallel that I really wanted to explore further.
And I hear you explain what you researched and how you observed, communal place, coffee shops, and so on and so forth. And my brain just goes, I picture the workplace because, in essence, that's what we're trying to create. We're trying to create communities. We're trying to create safe environments where individuals can come together, share their knowledge, and feel free and have that ability to actually optimize themselves, right?
Yeah,
So obviously, how do you then take that study and then apply it to the workplace? What sort of some of your methodologies that you take and apply to that?
sure. So there are every anthropologist is different, and but there is a set of methods that's more associated with anthropologists and maybe other methods. We often use something called ethnography, and ethnography is essentially the creation of um, a study of the people you're working with. And then you can use multiple different types of methods in order to do that. Just that ethnography is the general approach that we take, is we're focused on the people, and then we're focused on learning about the people. We're focused on learning about how culture as a set of ideas and a set of practices, how it emerges within a particular space, but to explore culture and to explore sort of that dialogue between basically the ideas of how we see the world with what we actually do. Um, we take quite a few different methods. One of the ones that's very much associated is called participant observation, and that's what we were describing earlier. That's basically the kind of the you might have read somewhere of an anthropologist maybe going to a bar and then scribbling down some notes and maybe running to the restroom or something to actually write them down in full. That's kind of participant observation. So you're immersing yourself within the space, but you're writing down your responses to the space, but also what people are doing within the space and what they're saying, their their sort of their motions, the way they're portraying themselves, and how they're also interacting with each other, just the practices and going on. You're trying to soak it all in, basically, and you're trying to immerse yourself. And that what that does is that gives you a picture of sort of the what people are doing, and it starts to give you an impression of sorts of developments that are happening that may not have been clear through a survey, for example. Um, that leads to another point is that although participant observation is a qualitative method, we also often do quantitative methods, and I view myself as a mixed methods anthropologist. And what I mean by that is that I think that it's very important to have the qualitative side so that you kind of understand more of the why of what's happening, but or to get a good impression of the patterns, then we also certainly acknowledge and we certainly acknowledge and we certainly do surveys, which we would view as a way to see patterns of interaction. We would view surveys as a way to look at. So I think if we're looking at a workplace context, the survey would um, give us an idea of okay, so how satisfied are people in the with the like the employee satisfaction surveys. So how
Hmm.
satisfied is the workforce? How satisfied are they with the tools? How satisfied are they with the space? But then we wouldn't just do that. We would want to go a step further, and we would want to actually go into the spaces and observe how they're interacting. And then we'd want to do interviews. And so interviews are a way for us to, in a structured manner, get at to ask why they're doing something. So it might have been we observed um, people going to one meeting room over another. In an interview setting, we might ask them just why they did that. And I mean, because as an anthropologist, we view ourselves as observers and also learners. So we would just ask them, okay, so what is it about this room versus that one? Why did you do that? What kind of collaboration tools are you using? Why are you using them? Why aren't you using any others? And then we might want to also go maybe a bit more into how they work with each other. So maybe going beyond this individual perception of being one user within the space to thinking more about how they're collaborating with people in the space as well, and how they're forming relationships with their colleagues, and how trust is being formed. In order to do that, we would also pay attention to how they're interacting with their colleagues. We want to see more of how they view collaboration. Is it one-way street, or is it like a two-way street? And what do what happens, what comes out of that collaboration, what do they get out of it? So that's sort of the things that we would explore. And there are a bunch of different methods to do that, and there are processes to do that in a remote way and in a business-friendly way. So I think I'll just leave that up to you to kind of, what would you like to dig in further?
No, it's and I'm smiling, Chris, because quite honestly, those people who know me just know that I'm so excited about it because they just know how my mind works, and the way you've articulated it is, I think, a natural process that I think most people, organizations, call it HR departments, real estate, technology, we're all going through and we're all asking ourselves, how do we get to that end game? And what you've just articulated is a process I think we all need to go through. And I can see many challenges in today's environment. And as we think about your process you just outlined there are elements that we can do, and there's elements that are really hard to do right now, right? So surveys, so we can get
Yeah,
that qualitative data that sort of survey. Okay, I want this. I want this. I want to go in X amount of days. I want to have a hybrid model. I want to do this. All the rest. What we can't do is observe, right? The observation comes, well, everyone's at home. There is, okay, what can we do? We can see outcomes that people are producing, but we can't actually see the environment with which they're operating. We don't know how their perceptions or their behaviors is going to shift as we go through time. So how do we assess that element of it? What would be your guidance, understanding that you're not going to have the definitive answer? I appreciate that, but how should people approach that?
so I guess to take a step back, to show more about where my perspective is coming from.
Yeah.
Before getting back into workplace, I um, worked as an applied researcher with an umbrella of tech startups. And within the tech industry and within overall product design, there's a field called user experience research. And anthropologists are definitely involved in UX research, and they have been have been for a while. And one of the, as a result of sort of the way that applied anthropology has developed over the years, there has been sort of the creation of a toolkit of approaches that you can use for
Mm-hmm.
remote research. And so, and that sort of accelerated with the pandemic. You have things called netnography, which would be a digital version of ethnography. So in the case of netnography, um, you could actually see how people are organizing and how people are collaborating on the remote platforms that they're using. It's a specific approach to observation, but adapted to a digital context. And then in terms of interviews, you can also do interviews remotely um, through Zoom and through other methods. And so there isn't, in terms of applying an ethnographic approach now, there are very few barriers just because there's a set of methods that is continually being developed. Now, I think the question is more of, well, when do you apply them, right? And so what I would actually say is to kind of to take a step back, I would be very curious to learn more about how remote workers are experiencing work as I see it now, how they're experiencing remote work and how they're experiencing collaboration with each other remotely. Because the work, as I think the pandemic has shown, the workplace itself isn't just the physical environment. It's more of I see it as more of a collection of spaces, and I see it as more of a collection of processes that people go through. And so you're in one space when, like through Skype, like we are now,
Hmm.
but if we were both in offices, we would also simultaneously be in a physical setting, but we're also working right now. And so I would definitely be very interested in learning more about not just the satisfaction that remote workers have with their environments, but also um, to hear from them directly. How are they interacting right now? How are they collaborating with each other? What spaces are they using right now? Because if we, and I also want to observe how they're interacting, maybe to take part in a Zoom call, or maybe to do an observations of a Slack platform that they're using, because all of this can tell us about what their experience will be like when they return to the workplace. So what tools are they really finding useful now? And
Hmm.
what processes are they doing now? Because those processes and those tools will then still be used if they haven't returned to the office, they'll still be used when they return to the office. So I think if we look at the remote working experience, then we can get clues and we can sort of forecast what will be needed for whenever the official return is.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you, and I do believe absolutely in the approach that you're mentioning, and the way I sort of come at it is absolutely 100% focus groups. It has to be location by location, team by team within those locations, conversations with each of them, like you said, interviews, but then it's also getting to the deep understanding why, right?
Yeah.
So, what type of work are you doing? So I do a lot, 50% focus work is what somebody may say. Well, okay, so where is the best place that you perceive for
Yeah.
that to happen? We think about, where people are going and where they're going to come back to the office or they're work from home. Where is the best place that you perceive that to be? Collaboration, whenever you're talking across a team, where is the best place for that team to have that collaboration? For some, it may well be, like you said, it may be on a remote, it may be on some whiteboard on a screen that they can just simply get on and collaborate together. But for others, it's no, they need a whiteboard, they need to be in a room, and trying to get to that level of detail, it really
Yeah.
is. It really is. I almost look at it as hand-to-hand combat, right? Because you have to get into the weeds, you have to get into the trenches, you have to try and engage yourself to really get to know the employees at every location around the world. This is hard, really hard. You know?
Yeah, it's that's where I would advocate for the use of surveys, at least would be to look at um the that'll give you a taste for the patterns of what people are doing. But
Yeah.
then that's where, once you have an idea of the patterns, that's when you start to go into it. But you can maybe start with a focus group, and then once you have a focus group of people, then you start to think, okay, well, now I want to understand what this person says outside of their colleagues. So then you go interview them, or maybe as you're doing the focus group, you're thinking, okay, but what people are saying is different than what they do. So I'll go and
Mm.
I will now observe them maybe through Slack. And so I think it's all really important, and I agree with you. Um, I think understanding the tasks and understanding the priorities that people have, I think those who work for you, I think as we were saying the other day, will have a good understanding of what they need to do in order to keep their job, and they'll tell you because they want to be successful in what they do,
Right.
and you're going out of your way to help them because you're
Right.
asking them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think just getting that level of detail is possible, but I think it's also very useful because as we move into a hybrid workplace, there would be an arrangement of spaces that can be used.
Yeah, I just find it interesting that you don't entirely believe what employees tell us, you know. But then, just taking what you just said, I just want to move on to another slide you sent. I took this from one of your presentations, harnessing the complexity for workplace experience. So we just mentioned the social network analysis and visualize a collaboration, right? So, that's in essence what you're just is that what you just described, or is that something different that we need to be considering?
Hmm. So, um, I said at one point that I'm a mixed methods anthropologist, and social network analysis is another tool that I use. And to give you an overview, and then I'll go into it with an example from my fieldwork to make it a bit more concrete. So, social network analysis is a tool that's been derived from, it's often referred to as network science, and it's often connected with big data,
Mm.
um, like the term big data. But the goal of network analysis is to visualize the relationships that people have. So each person is, within network analysis, each person is considered a node. And then, but they're not just separate, they're also connected with other people. And so there are other nodes in these networks, but then they're connected through lines which are referred to as ties. And what that can show you is that can give you a good picture of actually the structure of social relationships within a particular setting. And then you can even go further, and then you can visualize, for example, if we're talking about exchange of emails, then when someone sends an email to another person, that can be visualized in the form of an arrow.
Hmm.
And then the other person, if they send one back, that's another arrow. So you can have one arrow going to them and they can have an arrow going to you. But then if you take the picture of the diagram that's produced, then you have, and you can see sort of who's interacting with whom, and you can see who has interacted with someone else over time. And then you can go into the strength of those ties. And so I think when we have the phrase the strength of weak ties, and we start to think about the weak ties and how beneficial the weak ties are for workplace cohesion and social capital, that's really coming from network analysis, because the you can quantify the strength through, for example, looking at the amount of interactions, or maybe if you're or maybe towards the different settings where people interact. You can have that taken account in the network diagram as well. And then I think in terms of the weak ties, I think just to give an example of where that argument is coming from. So a guy with the last name of Granovetter did a network study in Boston. His interest really at one point was looking at how do people get a job, and so what he found just through this massive network study that he did was he found that um, dense social networks provide a lot of support, and they provide necessary support that people need. But he also found that the people that you don't interact with most often are often the ones who are going to be giving you information about jobs. So you might get your support from very close friends, but you might learn about the job through a former colleague you've met 5 years ago. And the reason is that knowledge flow between close friends is much more regular. But between an occasional acquaintance, it really doesn't happen that often. So you're more likely to hear interesting things from people you don't really know. And that's just how the dynamics flow. And I think just to bring it back to the workplace and the built environment, I used it when I was in Pristina in Kosovo as a way to actually understand the relationships that were happening before me. So I had observed and I had asked, but I still wanted to have a good concrete image of how exactly those behaviors were affecting relationships. Because one thing to talk about is one thing to actually see it on paper. And so what I did was I asked the people I had worked with. Well, first off, I had found that the cafe was a setting for social interaction. And I had found that the exchange of coffee could symbolize interaction. So I knew from my observations that was a really important thing. And I had decided to, and I had hypothesized that that could be a way for people to form relationships with each other. So I tested that hypothesis by asking the people I was speaking with to write down the names of those they had coffee with, like the current week,
Hmm.
and then the amount of times they had coffee with them. And then I asked them to keep a diary of their interactions for the following week. and to do the same thing. And I did this 3 times with people over the course of my time in Pristina. And what emerged was a diagram of coffee interactions and cafe networks that, when overlaid with the ethnographic data that I'd gathered, that really showed how social capital emerges within the space. And with you can use this in a workplace setting through um, asking people perhaps, okay, who did you have a meeting with previous week, and who are you going to have a meeting with the next week? And what that'll do is that'll very simply and very quickly give you a good picture of even how people are collaborating in the environment, because if you can drill down into exactly what kind of interaction you're looking for, but it'll also give you a good picture of knowledge flow within the environment on
Hmm.
how, and if you overlay that with maybe a diagram of the space, you could also look at the networks and how they could potentially shift due to the spaces they're in. So there are a lot of direct applications.
There's so many questions, Chris, and everything you just said. Because it's for me, it's fascinating. Because I think about those nodes, I think about the social cohesion that you're able to study and understand with that depth of analysis. But I just wonder with those social cues and the nodes, whenever we're in this remote environment and we're looking to get people back to the office and we're trying to figure out how do we do that, how would you take that sort of analysis? Understand you can't observe, but
Yeah.
directly, right? But there's probably other ways you said about using
Yeah.
technology. But
Hmm.
then, how do organizations decide or
Hmm.
provide employees with information that may be beneficial to them and the organization through that analysis of who should be at home and who should be in the office and when?
Well, I think that so it's basically kind of how insights are derived and then how they're distributed, right? Because it's a
Yeah.
wonderful thing to have all this information, but then how does it actually get put into action? So a way that you can do that is actually through the design thinking process, kind of used very broadly. So in the first step of design thinking, you have the part where you define the problem. And then once you define the problem, you then start to ideate and create solutions. And once you've created solutions, you then prototype and then you test. And it kind of continues like that in an iterative fashion. And so where this fits in is this really fits in with helping you to learn more about the user and learn more about the employee. Um, and then the way that you sort of bring that into dialogue is then um, what someone like me would do is that you would have done all this stuff, but then you would try to bring that into wider circulation through doing things like workshops and doing things like um, sort of sessions where you're talking with stakeholders about what it is the employees and the users are of the workspace would be saying and what they're feeling and what they're doing. But then you're also potentially using it as a catalyst for change through bringing in. So you've done all these things, but now you're going to through workshops. You can tell the people you worked with as part of the research, and you can tell them and the stakeholders what was happening, and so it could become part of a discussion. So you're getting the information, but as an anthropologist, you're also constantly trying to bring it back into circulation or to prompt discussion.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that. Is there then a feedback loop in that process to the employee? So the employee gets to, okay, this is what I said, this is what I observed, and then this is the reality, and therefore they get that feedback loop?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
that's entirely part of it because
yeah.
anthropologists, researchers in general, even though they might not want to admit it, are embedded within the process. As soon as you start doing research with someone, you're involving yourself in their life in some way, even if it is as simple as giving them a survey.
Yeah.
What anthropologists do is that they acknowledge that their world, their presence has, but then they constantly analyze it so they can take it into account. But then they will go back and they'll say, okay, so this is what we saw, and I wanted to let you know that. And so then, as there is a feedback loop, the anthropologists can continue to be there. And so as solutions are prototyped and developed, the anthropologists can go back and they can see more of, okay, so how is the environment changing? What role in that shift? What did that role play in changing the structure of collaboration here? So there is constantly a dialogue and a process that the anthropologist is part of.
Chris, it's absolutely fascinating, and I mean, I have so many more questions, and we definitely got to get you back on and sort of run through some of these things again,
Of
because
course.
as we think about the complexities as what everyone's trying to solve for today and tomorrow, the uncertainty and the uh, we have no ability of what the future looks like, right? So it's I'm just fascinated to hear some of your thoughts and hear some of your guidance and lessons that you can share with the community.
Sure,
And
sounds good.
I'd love to get you. I'd love to get you back on, but like, thank you. I appreciate it, mate. I really, really do. Folks, if you've enjoyed listening to Chris, please do reach out to him. There is a link below where you can reach out to him on LinkedIn. Do ask him some questions. He's very responsive. He shares his insights, and he's all over LinkedIn, and honestly, he is a great source of information, a great source of knowledge, and a very different perspective, as we've just heard. Very logical and very process oriented and data driven. So, yeah. So thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time today.
Well,
And
thanks so
that's
much for inviting me, Steve. I
no,
appreciate it as well.
it's my pleasure. I've learned a lot, and I will continue to learn a lot from you. I know. So folks, look, thank you. No show tomorrow. Back on Monday. But have a great weekend, and Chris, thanks again.
Thanks a lot, Steve.
Cheers.